Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the recent demolition of houses and properties by the state government of Madhya Pradesh to punish alleged rioters following recent communal clashes in the state. The writers of the column argue that such arbitrary demolition of houses and properties without following the due process of law violates not just the provisions of the Indian Constitution and the principle of natural justice, but also violates India's commitments to certain international laws. See, recently in Madhya Pradesh, communal clashes were reported during festivals between the two communities. Following these clashes, government authorities identified the alleged rioters, and based on these allegations, the properties of those who were allegedly involved in these riots were bulldozed and demolished by the Madhya Pradesh government. But media reports have shown that the demolition was arbitrary in nature, and many people who had nothing to do with the riots, even they have been punished and their houses have been bulldozed by the government. The state government has justified these demolitions by stating that it serves quick and swift justice to the perpetrators, and these actions are based on a law that was recently enacted by the Madhya Pradesh government. The law allows the state government to attach the properties of those who are involved in destruction of public property as a form of deterring riots and violence. While the law allows the attaching of property to those cases, it does not allow the state to demolish those properties, and such actions cannot be taken without following the due process of law. Because unless and until the accused are held guilty by the courts, and unless and until their guilt is proven through evidence, any such unilateral action taken by the government is going to be blatantly illegal and unconstitutional. But Madhya Pradesh has borrowed this concept of serving quick justice to rioters from Uttar Pradesh. In 2020, the UP government enacted a law known as UP Recovery of Damages to Public and Private Property Act, which allows the government authorities to recover damages from those who were allegedly involved in destroying public property. But this law has already been challenged on the grounds of its constitutionality and legality, because government authorities cannot act on their own and punish the accused by demolishing their property without even establishing their guilt in courts and without even following the due process. According to the writers of the column, such bulldozing of properties of the accused has become a symbol of brute state power, which is being arbitrarily used to not just demolish properties of the accused, but it also demolishes the rule of law and the constitutional order. Because according to legal experts, such demolitions has to follow the due process of law and should have the legal sanction, or else it would violate not just our domestic laws, but also our constitutional principles, including fundamental rights, and as well as India's commitments to international conventions and international law. Because a basic principle under rule of law and principle of natural justice is that an accused is presumed to be innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This guilt has to be established by the government, that is by the prosecution, in a court by following the due process, and only if there is sufficient evidence to hold the accused guilty, only then the courts will deliver punishment to those who have been convicted after following due process and rule of law. This is a basic essence of any constitutional democracy, and the government cannot take such action on its own, just on the basis of presumption of guilt, because the authority to punish the guilty only lies with the courts as per the rule of law, and any such arbitrary action by the government against those who are allegedly involved in rioting will not just violate domestic laws in the constitution, but also violates India's commitment to international laws. This is where we need to talk about the right to adequate housing and how it is not just a fundamental right recognized under the Indian Constitution, but it is also a basic human right recognized under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. See, through various rulings of the Supreme Court, the right to adequate housing has been clearly upheld as a fundamental right that emanates from the right to life and dignity enshrined under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. This right to adequate housing is well documented under International Human Rights Framework as well. And Article 25 of the UDHR clearly states that everyone has the right to a standard of living that is adequate for their health and well-being, including their family. And this extends to right to food, clothing, housing, medical care, etc. Now, using this as an opportunity, let us learn a few important points about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This international document was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, and it recognizes and enshrines the basic rights and freedoms of all human beings. It recognizes the basis and extent of human rights, and as well as a set of economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, and the conditions that are necessary for the exercise of these rights. It recognizes that every human is born free and equal, deserving of equal rights and dignity without any discrimination. As an extension to this, a set of civil and political rights have been recognized as integral to human rights. For example, this includes the right to life, liberty, and security, the right to equal treatment by the law, the right to privacy, right to freedom of belief and religion, prohibition of slavery and torture, the right to equality before law and fair public hearing, and the right to be treated as innocent until proven guilty. It also comes with a host of other civil and political rights that have been listed over here that covers the freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, right to take part in the government, right to own property, etc. Then if you look under economic, social and cultural rights, right to social security, right to form trade unions, right to leisure, and right to education and cultural life have been recognized. In the context of our discussion, Article 25 is what is relevant because it recognizes the right to an adequate standard of living, which also includes the right to adequate housing. So in this context, one can argue that the demolition of properties by the state government of Madhya Pradesh, without establishing the guilt of the accused in a court, violates all these international commitments of India, as these obligations are legally binding on India. Then, apart from the UDHR, we have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, under which Article 11.1 recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, which also covers the right to adequate housing. Under this provision, the signatory countries have an obligation to take appropriate steps to ensure that their citizens can realize the right to adequate housing. As per Article 4 of this international covenant, these rights can be restricted by states only in a manner as prescribed by law, with the intention of promoting the general welfare of the society. Article 5 of the international covenant clearly recognizes that these basic rights cannot be taken away in an arbitrary manner without following the due process of law. Then for prelims and mains, you should be aware of the basic details about the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. This covenant was adopted in 1966 and came into force in 1976. It commits the signatories to work towards upholding basic human rights that extends to their economic, social and cultural rights. This includes labor rights, the right to health, right to education, and right to an adequate standard of living. As per latest data, 171 countries are party to the International Covenant, and 4 other countries have signed it, including the United States, but they haven't ratified the International Covenant. This International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is monitored by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and it forms a part of the International Human Rights Framework as part of the International Bill of Human Rights, along with the UDHR and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we are going to discuss in the next slide. See, this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is an addition to the International Human Rights Framework. It's a multilateral treaty which was adopted by the UNGA in 1966 and came into force in 1976, along with the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There are 173 parties to this covenant, and few countries like China and Cuba have signed it, but they haven't ratified it. This covenant is also a key document which forms a part of the International Human Rights Framework as part of the International Bill of Human Rights. And these three international laws form the basis of global human rights. The compliance of member countries to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is monitored by the UN Human Rights Committee and also regularly reviews the performance of states with regard to upholding their commitments. Under this international law, arbitrary interference in individuals' right to property is explicitly prohibited. While Article 12 of UDHR states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with regard to their privacy, family, home, or correspondence, including arbitrary attacks against their honor and reputation, every individual has the right to seek the protection of law against such arbitrary interference or attacks by the state. The same right has been enshrined under Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as well, and it further provides that everyone has the right to own property and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of their property. So it again becomes clear that the demolition of properties of the accused by the state without following due process clearly amounts to arbitrary interference, which happens to be a gross violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In fact, even the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is often referred to as the UN Human Rights Office, has also elaborated on the right to adequate housing. This institution of the UN is mandated to promote and protect human rights that are guaranteed under the International Human Rights Framework. And according to the UN Human Rights Office, an integral element of the right to adequate housing is protection against any forced eviction by the state. This argument is further backed by several judicial rulings as well by the Supreme Court of India, because in several landmark cases, such as the Bachan Singh case, the Vishaka case, and in the Puttaswamy case, the Supreme Court has repeatedly highlighted the need to incorporate international human rights laws into our judicial process in order to bring India's laws and constitution in line with these international laws. In the landmark case, Puttaswamy case, when the Supreme Court recognized right to privacy as a fundamental right, it relied upon linking our fundamental rights in the Constitution with India's obligations and commitments to international human rights framework. The same was done in the Vishaka case as well, in which the Supreme Court laid down guidelines to protect women from sexual harassment at workplace. So in conclusion, if you look at the fundamental rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution and the obligations under international law, such as UDHR, International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and club them with Supreme Court rulings, it becomes very clear that the state cannot deprive these rights of citizens arbitrarily without following due process, and it cannot deprive them of their right to adequate housing by arbitrarily demolishing their houses and properties just on the basis of allegations that the accused were involved in rioting. Now let's look at an article from the front cover page, which helps us understand India's dependency on coal and India's plans to transition away from coal. See, according to this article, India's finance minister has stated that due to the war in Ukraine, India's plans to move away from coal has been hit. This statement was made by the finance minister when she was interacting with the managing director of IMF, and India has made it clear to the Western countries that India's transition plans to move away from coal and to decarbonize the Indian economy is going to take a hit because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Western sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. But to make sense of this argument of India, first you need to understand what is India's dependency on coal and what are India's transition plans. For this, we need to take a look at India's energy basket, which is clearly depicted in this graph over here. And just like most countries, India's energy supply largely comes from coal, oil, and gas. Over the years, our dependency on coal has increased exponentially to meet the rising energy demands of the Indian economy. And the demand for coal has sustained at very high levels, even though India has tried to diversify its energy basket by focusing on non-fossil sources such as nuclear and renewable sources. But for the coming decades, India cannot continue on the same path, and there is an urgent need for India to shift away from its coal dependency. As of now, nearly 55% of India's electricity demand is met through coal-based sources, and most of the coal needed for this power generation is either sourced domestically within India, but due to quality and production issues in the domestic market, India also relies heavily on coal imports, especially from Australia and Indonesia. So, to meet India's electricity demands, India is heavily dependent on coal as a source for power, and nearly 55% of electricity generation is happening through coal based power plants. But this path is no longer sustainable for India, mainly because of its climate change commitments. Because India has already emerged as the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the United States. So, as a result, India has been under tremendous pressure from other countries to reduce its dependency on coal. And during the recent climate change summit that was held at Glasgow, that is during the 26th Conference of Parties, there was a lot of pressure on India to strive towards achieving net zero emissions as soon as possible. And during this summit, instead of falling under the pressure of other countries to phase out coal, India and China applied a counter pressure to instead focus on phasing down coal, that is, to gradually reduce its consumption instead of seeking an outright phasing out, which could adversely affect our electricity supplies and our economy. So, after convincing the other countries to switch from phasing out to phasing down coal, India took up a voluntary commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, whereas Western countries have pledged to achieve net zero by 2045, and China has pledged to achieve net zero by 2060. During this summit, India has also committed to source half of its electricity from renewable sources of energy by the end of this decade, by achieving a 500 gigawatt installed capacity from renewable sources of energy by 2030. But to make this transition from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, India cannot adopt a overnight switch. So, in order to phase down its consumption of coal, India will have to rely upon a transition fuel. That is, India will have to start relying on another fossil fuel source, which is less polluting and which contributes to lower greenhouse gas emissions as compared to coal. And the answer for this lies in natural gas. Natural gas is considered to contribute relatively less to greenhouse gas emissions as compared to coal, and as a result, natural gas is considered as a transition fuel. And one of the biggest suppliers of natural gas to India happens to be Russia. See, out of India's total energy imports, 1 to 2% of it is met from Russia, and Russia happens to be a key supplier of oil and natural gas to India. India plans to switch its heavy dependency on coal towards natural gas and use it as a transition fuel because coal releases nearly 2 times the amount of carbon dioxide for the same quantity of natural gas. So, in the short to medium term, natural gas will help India to slowly make a switch or a transition towards cleaner forms of fuel and gradually help reduce its dependency on coal, thereby helping India achieve its net zero emission target by 2070. Parallelly, India has plans to decarbonize its economy to achieve this ambitious target, along with the other climate action goals that India has taken up as a part of its Paris Agreement commitments. To achieve these ambitious targets, India is looking to diversify its energy sources and move away from coal and focus on renewables such as solar and wind, cleaner forms of energy like electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, ultra efficient batteries, etc., and also nuclear sources of energy to put in place a long term plan which will help India decarbonize its economy and reduce its dependency on coal. But to get here, India will require the help of a transition fuel such as natural gas, which will serve our short to medium term economic objectives. But as the supplies of natural gas from Russia has been hit due to Western economic sanctions, India has pointed out to the IMF and the Western countries that the war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia is hurting energy supplies to India, particularly that of natural gas supplies, which in turn hampers India's transition plans. Next, in this column on page number 7, the writer argues that India should focus on reducing its cost of doing business in order to make the Indian economy more competitive so that India's growth story can be sustained by creating adequate jobs for the enormous working age population of India, which is a direct result of its demographic dividend. He makes a case for setting the price distortions right with regard to key raw materials, supplies, and services, which is adversely harming the Indian economy and the competitiveness of the Indian economy. See, one way to improve ease of doing business is by focusing on the cost of doing business. But the writer argues that despite the LPG reforms, which liberalized, privatized, and globalized the Indian economy, there are still several government policies which is directly contributing to price distortion of key raw materials. And this is directly contributing to increased cost of business for companies and factories, which in turn takes a direct hit on the growth prospects and competitiveness of the Indian economy. See, for example, if you look at the price distortion with regard to prices of petrol and diesel, and how policies by subsequent governments have encouraged this price distortion, you will realize how the Indian economy has been adversely affected by the pricing difference between petrol and diesel and by the margin of taxes that is levied by the government on petrol and diesel. See, in the earlier days, cars were considered as a luxury and hence very high excise duty was levied on petrol. But parallelly, the prices of diesel was heavily subsidized by the government and the prices were kept very low as compared to petrol prices, as diesel was critical for transportation and for the overall economy. But this led to a situation where the petrol diesel prices were being directly controlled by the government, and the distortion led the consumers to opt for diesel cars and SUVs. And this demand was met by the car manufacturers as well, thereby diverting government subsidization of diesel towards high end consumers, whereas the common man and the industry continue to suffer. To address this distortion, the prices of petrol and diesel were liberalized from government control, and the taxes on diesel were also increased to gradually increase its price, so that there is only a marginal difference between the petrol price and diesel price. But while the deregulation of petrol diesel prices was seen as an economic reform, it led the government to follow another distortionary policy, under which it started levying heavy taxes on petrol and diesel to generate revenue to the government. And eventually, the government became so dependent on this revenue that it has kept petrol and diesel outside of the purview of GST in order to use this revenue to bridge its fiscal deficit. But these high taxes on petrol and diesel has led to another distortion, which has pushed up fuel inflation in the economy, thereby directly increasing the cost of doing business for Indian industries. The same can be seen in the case of electricity as well, because even electricity pricing is highly distorted in the country as a result of government policies. So such pricing distortion of essential supplies and raw materials directly affects the competitiveness of the Indian economy, as their cost of doing business goes up significantly, and this affects the overall growth prospects of the Indian economy. Hence, the writer is calling upon the government to focus on reducing the cost of doing business by addressing the pricing distortion seen in key raw materials and supplies and services. Now let's take up this article from page number 11. See, recently, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India decided to adopt a health star rating system on packaged food items in order to highlight the nutritional quality and nutritional standard of the food item, in order to encourage a behavioral change amongst the consumers, to discourage them from buying unhealthy food products. This health star rating system was recommended by IIM Ahmedabad following a study, and this was being implemented by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Under this rating system, food manufacturers will be mandated to carry a star label on the front of package labeling, that is on the front side of the packaged food product, which will highlight the nutritional quality and standard of the food product on a scale of half star to 5 star. In fact, this model is already in practice in other countries such as Australia and New Zealand, but experts have pointed out that such a star rated system has not really helped in introducing any meaningful behavioral change amongst the consumers. And according to healthcare experts and nutritionists, a star rating system will not fully convey the nutritional standard and quality of the food product. Because under this system, the number of stars that are awarded to a food product is dependent on its positive and negative ingredients. Ingredients such as fruits, nuts, etc. get classified as positive ingredients, whereas ingredients such as sugar, salt, sodium, fat are listed as negative ingredients. Under this star rating system, the positive ingredients will offset the negative ingredients, thereby resulting in a better star ranking for the product, even though if it contains high levels of sugar, salt, sodium, and fat. For example, let's say there is a snack being sold by a company. Even though the snack contains very high levels of sugar, salt, sodium, and fat, if it includes fruit and nuts, automatically its star rating will improve, and thereby it paints a misleading picture to the consumer regarding its nutritional quality and standard. Hence, critics of the policy have argued that there has been no evidence from Australia and New Zealand to suggest that this policy led to any meaningful behavioral change. And they have argued that instead of the star rating system, descriptive warning labels on the food packaging has been found to be more effective in helping the consumer understand the kind of harmful ingredients present in a food product, which then pushes them to make meaningful behavioral changes. Next, according to this article on page number 11, N.K. Singh, the chairperson of the 15th Finance Commission, has warned that a few states in India could witness a sub-national bankruptcy as they are headed towards a fiscal disaster due to unnecessary and wasteful expenditure on populist schemes and initiatives. See, political parties are driven to announce populist initiatives as a part of their electoral campaigns, where they announce free power supply, free water supply, laptops, televisions, and other such unnecessary initiatives in order to grab the attention of the voters. And once they are elected to power, they will be forced to fulfill these populist promises. Such wasteful, unnecessary expenditure shoots up the expenditure of the government, thus pushing the state government with limited revenue towards a fiscal disaster. This is seen to be happening in the case of a number of states, such as Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Bihar, etc., where many populist schemes are being implemented, which don't really serve a true socio-economic purpose. See, if government subsidies are well targeted, and if they are given on the basis of merit, and for promoting larger socio-economic benefits, such as sustaining the public distribution system, funding employment guarantee schemes like Manrega, or for supporting healthcare and education, then in such cases, government subsidies are justified. But if government funds are being used and spent on unnecessary expenditures like free power, free water, laptops, televisions, bicycles, etc., it doesn't really serve a larger socio-economic purpose, and it simply ends up becoming a massive financial burden on the state's budget. So according to N.K. Singh, the chairperson of the 15th Finance Commission, such spending by certain states as a result of populist schemes is pushing these states towards a fiscal disaster, and if course correction is not made, there are chances of these states going bankrupt. And in such cases, even the central government won't be able to help them out because the central assistance to states is limited to times of disasters or distress, apart from the constitutionally mandated devolution of revenue that the center is obligated to provide for state governments. Now let's take up the mains practice questions. The first question: arbitrary demolition of property by the state violates the fundamental right to adequate housing recognized under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. Discuss in the context of international human rights law framework. The second question: examine India's dependency on coal and the country's progress towards shifting to cleaner forms of fuel. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been shared in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.